Welcome to Save the Farms, Disaster Recovery for SharePoint. My name is Peter Cartier. I'm going to start us off with a little intro here. First of all, I'd like to once more welcome everyone. If you've been with us before, welcome back. Those of you joining us for the first time, what you've stumbled into is a high-level overview of topics pertaining to the cloud, SharePoint, and the like. We pulled together some of the greatest creative minds in the industry to name these talks and ended up brilliantly blending our name, Fpweb.net, with webinar to create Fpwebinar. So we're patting ourselves on the back for that. This is our third Fpwebinar. In the past, we've covered the difference between private and public clouds. More recently, we covered hybrid clouds. And we like to end each chat, as I was saying earlier, with a Q&A segment. We're going to address any thoughts or questions you might have during the talk. So tweet us any questions using hashtag Fpwebinar, or just use the chat feature on your GoToMeeting screen. Today we talk about disaster recovery for SharePoint. I'll get us started with a little background info. Disaster recovery is a critical step in business continuity planning. It's an attack or incident that can't be predicted, but it can be prepared for. Whether you suffer a natural disaster, an IT hiccup, or a malicious attack against your business, you can prevent serious loss, downtime, or potential shutdown by setting up a disaster recovery plan, or we'll call it DRP most of the time. This is going to allow for the continuation of your technology infrastructure. So what this webinar hopes to accomplish is to define that term for you, for your SharePoint environment, and show you how to plan for your specific business needs. So typically large businesses are more ready to handle these kind of things. Now that's going to be result from maybe a larger capital to put continuity plans in place, but either way the need for it is just as prevalent and just as real for small to medium-sized businesses that are trying to prevent possible shutdown. I'll set the stage, I'll throw a few stats at you, and we'll see where you fit in. Gartner estimates that only 35% of small and medium businesses have a comprehensive disaster recovery plan in place. So the cost of downtime ends up being big money per hour. International Data Corps estimates that companies lose an average of $84,000 for every hour of downtime. According to a recent NFIB National Small Business Poll, man-made disasters affect 10% of small businesses, whereas natural disasters have impacted more than 30% of small businesses in the USA. Looking at an Abaco study, they estimate 20% of companies suffer fire, flood, power failures, terrorism, or hardware and software disasters. Of those without a DRP, 80% that experience a significant data loss are likely to go out of business within a month. 43% of businesses that aren't able to resume operations within 10 days of a disaster will go the way of the dodo and never reopen. A recent Touche-Ross study put the survival rate of companies without a DRP at less than 10%. So I can keep up with the scare tactics and continue throwing stats at you, but the point is simply to address a key fact. Businesses are not as prepared as they should be for a possible disaster, and failure to prepare can lead to a closed for business sign on the door indefinitely. Now with me today, I have two individuals who deal with disaster recovery every day. Jesse Roche, Joe Beyer. They're both focusing on the DR planning for SharePoint because that's where their expertise lies. They'll be the first to tell you, though, this information is high level, pertains to typical tech environments for the most part as well. So I'll let them take it from here and join back at the end for some Q&A. Gentlemen.
Thanks, Peter. Hello, everyone. As Peter mentioned, I'm Jesse Roche, and I'm the VP of Sales at Fpweb.net. But I also have an IT background of over 15 years. It includes everything from being an engineer, managing support teams, working as a sales engineer, and also as a technical project manager. So basically, I'm dangerous enough to be able to talk to people about their needs and then ensure we cover them on the back end with the help of a great team, and that leads us to Joe.
Thanks, Jesse. Good morning, everyone. As mentioned, my name is Joe Beyer. I am the Senior SharePoint Administrator / Project Manager here at Fpweb. I've been here at Fpweb for about 2.5 years now. Been in the IT industry as a whole for just about 12 years. My background before SharePoint was in the hardware networking, so that tends to mix well with SharePoint as well. I do a lot of the builds and migrations, and I manage the build process from start to finish. And lastly, I'm a point of escalation for our support team. So that's enough about me. Let's go ahead and get started. The big question is, what is disaster recovery? Well, disaster recovery is just that. It's a way to recover your data should a disaster occur. It doesn't matter if that's a fire, a hurricane, earthquake, any of those. Disasters don't announce themselves, so it's best just to be prepared. Having a plan means that your data exists in multiple geographical locations. Now, without disaster recovery, your data could potentially be lost forever. Now, let's take a minute and think about that. What would happen if your business lost all of their data? As Peter mentioned, many companies cannot even recover from that. So, as I'm sure you're aware, with downtime comes a cost, and it can vary depending on your industry. Companies depend on their SharePoint for daily operations. Many companies even have SharePoint for their public-facing site. So if your site goes down, that more or less means loss of revenue, and that in itself is a disaster. So let's welcome Jesse back in to discuss those costs associated with downtime.
Okay, thanks, Joe. So let's talk a little bit about how we get started. Everything we do at Fpweb is basically around DRs, architected to our customers' needs. So if somebody comes to me and say, I need a DR plan, we really need to dig a bit deeper to find out kind of what that really means to them. So we've got some default plans that a lot of our customers fit into. But we really need to make sure which plan is really right to meet their needs. So how do we determine that? We start by identifying a couple of key variables, basically. The first one is the recovery point objective, or RPO. So most of you probably know what this is, but in case you need a quick refresher, it's simply how much data you can afford to lose. So if you can afford to lose a day's worth of data in a disaster, then something like nightly backups might suffice. If it needs to be a smaller amount of data, which is pretty typical, then we look at another solution like a warm backup, but we'll talk about that in just a bit. The second thing we need to know is the customer's recovery time objective, or RTO. The recovery time objective is simply the maximum amount of time after a disaster that your system or SharePoint farm can be down. So remember, everybody has their own definition and what it means to them, but this just helps us understand our customer's business and basically which DR option fits best. So speaking of options, I'm going to let Joe talk about a couple of these.
Okay, thanks, Jesse. So there's three types of disaster recovery, right? We classify those as cold, warm, and hot standbys. Now, the difference between the three essentially comes down to how long it takes, us to get your data back up and online and accessible to your customers and users. So let's start with the cold standby option. With the cold, that's basically defined as getting your data back up and online in hours or days. And in this scenario, it essentially comes down to just backing up your data to a secondary location. And that can be a second data center, backup facility, branch office, etc. Now, if it's a backup facility, more than likely there's a company that comes out, such as Iron Mountain, that comes and picks up backup tapes and stores them off-site. That's a pretty tedious process. And there's actually some software out there that can handle this automatically for us, such as Commvault. Iron Mountain also has a software, things along those lines. So being a SharePoint hosting provider, we essentially back up the VHD files to our secondary data center. And for those of you that don't know, a VHD file is a virtual hard drive. And the process here is basically the servers are built, initial backups are sent to that secondary location, and then from there, incrementals are then sent to capture any changes that have been made. And these changes can be captured every hour, day, month, etc., based on your needs. So another big question, what happens if a disaster occurs? Well, with the cold option, obviously this is the cheapest option, which also means the most amount of manual work should a disaster occur. So let's say a disaster occurs in Data Center 1, our engineers would then have to build a new server in Data Center 2, and from there, the VHD would then be attached to that new server, and your content would then be restored. Now, sticking with the SharePoint theme, the last step in this process is to update DNS to reflect the new public IP address so that your content is accessible in its new location. So with all options, there are pros and cons. Like I've said, the pros of the cold option, it is the cheapest option because there are no charges for additional hardware, software, or licensing. And, the biggest con for the cold would be, it is a complete manual process, so it does take a while. It has the most amount of downtime. And there are a few cost savings with the cold as well. As I mentioned, there's no charges for licensing hardware or software. The only additional charges would be for additional storage, and we all know storage is relatively cheap. So that about sums up the cold standby option. Let's move on to the warm standby option. And as I said with the cold, the recovery time was hours or days. With the warm, you're looking more along the lines of minutes or hours. And Microsoft has helped us out quite a bit with this option. In Windows Server 2012, they've introduced what's called HyperV Replica. And with HyperV Replica, you can build a new virtual server out, and in just 2 or 3 clicks, you can have that server replicated to that secondary location. Once the initial replication is complete, incrementals are then sent every 5 minutes, and this happens automatically, so there's no engineer intervention required, and it's a pretty seamless process. So with the warm, there are also pros and cons with this as well. The biggest pro, as I mentioned, is your environment could potentially be restored in as little as 10 minutes, and that's based on the size of your environment, the amount of data you have, things along those lines. So the biggest cons of the warm would be it is still a manual process. It doesn't fail over automatically. DNS still needs to be updated manually. So there is some time there. Some cost savings for warm. It's pretty similar to the cold. There are a few additional hardware charges, but as we know, licensing is very expensive, and since these replica servers will be powered off, there's no additional charges for licensing. So there's a huge cost savings there. Now we can bring Jesse back in to discuss the hot standby option.
Okay, thanks. So again, let's talk a little bit about hot standby or hot failover. Again, this is an automatic failover, so it's a bit different than the warm model Joe talked about because there's no manual intervention. So it looks similar to the warm environment. You still have a farm at 2 separate data centers, preferably a couple hundred miles away from each other. But instead of just passing the VHDs as Joe talked about, we would actually use a combination of load balancing and SQL always on. So this way, basically, your users would still be able to access the site when a disaster happens. So again, the pros of this are pretty simple. There's no data loss or interruption of service, so your RPO and RTO that we talked about earlier are basically zero. The cons are that we do have some additional equipment and licensing involved to basically make sure it functions properly. So the first thing we have taken into consideration is that, as Joe mentioned, with the warm option, you've got to manually update DNS. So to resolve this, we'll basically use a set of F5 big IP load balancers, and this would basically manage the DNS traffic. So that obviously adds to your hardware costs, but you no longer need to reach out to the domain name registrar to update your DNS settings. So that's good. The second piece is the SQL always on. So this is used to basically pass the data back and forth between the data centers. So again, we've got additional licensing that comes into play here. SQL Enterprise is used to use the always on. So for those of you maybe using SQL Enterprise for transparent data encryption, there is a pretty large increase in the cost for the license. So the third caveat, since you really don't have a passive node, you are required to pay for both sets of licensing on the farms. So what this really means is we really need to take into consideration of the size of the failover farm. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have an exact replica in the event of a disaster. So we can scale that to kind of save on costs. So as far as cost savings are concerned, the hot option is definitely the most expensive, but it really depends on what you're doing in SharePoint and how critical your farm and information is. So if you're like many companies and SharePoint's kind of become ingrained in your business, then I would pretty much say the cost savings and having it never offline and losing productivity are probably worth the investment. So with all that being said, one of the options that's been gaining traction that we haven't talked about yet is a hybrid option, and that's done with a current on-premise environment. So what it means in our world is essentially a customer would come to us and we would either be the production side or the DR side of their farm. So one side would be on-premise in their data center, and then the other side would reside on ours. So we can handle either side of this. It doesn't matter to us, but we most often see us being the production side just because our uptime is usually higher than the on-premise environment. So again, this is a good option for companies that maybe don't have multiple data centers or need some additional expertise around SharePoint. And don't have, maybe they already have a current farm with hardware, so they don't have to purchase multiple environments in the cloud. They can really get away with one and still kind of be protected. So this can also apply to smaller stuff as well. I know Joe talked earlier about the offsite backups and the cold option. So a lot of our customers will actually take their own SQL backups and push them to their data center. Basically, there's no cost around this because it's just really taking space on their drive. So again, there's really an option out there for everyone. It's really just kind of finding what fits best with your needs. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it back over to Joe.
All right, everyone. Well, that basically concludes the information we wanted to relay this morning. Again, this was just meant to be a high-level overview. We didn't want to get too technical. I mean, I'm sure we could sit here for 2 and 3 hours and discuss disaster recovery in greater detail, but we just want to get you on with your day as quick as possible. So a couple items I wanted to reiterate. As Peter was saying in the introduction, only 35% of small to medium businesses currently have a disaster recovery plan in place. 20% of businesses will suffer some type of disaster recovery throughout their lifetime. Only 80% of those businesses will recover, which means the other 20% will have a sign on their door and close forever. And as Jesse was mentioning there are no cookie cutter disaster recovery plans. They must be architected based on your needs and based on your industry. Okay, now let's bring Peter back in for a little Q&A. Peter?
All right, guys, thanks for doing this. Yeah, like Joe said, we keep it pretty short. We threw a lot of information at you, so we will be sending you guys the recording. And as with any of our Fpwebinars, if you know somebody that you think it could help, please feel free to send that along to them. Looking at some of the questions now. Okay, I got a good good intro question here. What is the best way to start the process of making a DRP?
Okay, I can take that. Basically, it's similar to what we talked about before. When someone calls in and kind of asks that question, the first thing that we really need to do is make sure they sit down with their IT team and really talk about their business continuity plan. So DR is really a part of that, but we kind of need to understand what their recovery point objective and their recovery time objective are, and that's really where it starts at. So we kind of need that information in order to really start architecting a plan. So sitting down with your business team and your IT team is really kind of the first step.
Thank you, Jesse. Second question here, I would assume we'll go to Joe. DNS can sometimes take quite a while to propagate. How will this affect my DR strategy?
Sure, I can take that one. That's actually a pretty good question. Just to reiterate for everyone out there that the cold and warm standby options do require manual DNS changes. And, that is the biggest concern with these type of options. So, we tell our customers they're going to need to contact their registrar and update their TTL, which is time to live, to 5 to 10 minutes. So when that IP address is changed, it only takes, a short amount of time to get that reaccessible.
All right, thank you. Let's see, checking. I think we got one more here. Yep, here it is. All right. Does the standby environment need to be the same as the primary environment?
Sure, I'll take that one again. It really depends. So the question, or I guess the answer would be yes and no. If we do a warm environment for someone, we would typically say, yes, we'd like to replicate that environment to the secondary data center. We're passing the VHDs over, so if you have a web front end and a SQL server, we would typically stand up the same web front end and SQL server on the replication environment. So in that case, we would have them be the same. If you've got a hot environment, as I mentioned, we typically would scale that down. So if we have, for example, an 8-server farm in the production environment, we'd probably scale it down and maybe even cut it in half to a 4-server farm in the DR, possibly adding a web front end to keep the load balancing. But again, it kind of depends on the environment itself. It definitely does not have to be.
Okay, just got a couple more questions come in. Derek asks, what about SharePoint on-premise and DR in the cloud?
Absolutely. So I'll take that one again. We actually do that often for customers. As I kind of mentioned, that's what we call the hybrid model. So for those customers that maybe don't have multiple data centers and they're looking for somewhere to have a recovery, we certainly have that conversation quite a bit. So we would basically sit down with you, kind of find out what your production farm looks like, and then we could scale for the DR side of things. It's really just a quick conversation to really understand what your current architecture is, what type of data you have, what you're doing with SharePoint, and then we can certainly architect something around that. So, yeah, absolutely.
All right, moving on. We have, let's see, question from Niraj asks, can we create the data center on our local server?
Not sure what he means with that. Can we create the data center on our local server?
Okay, we'll reach out to you and figure out exactly what you're asking and get you an answer for that. Peter asks, what is your experience doing warm DR with SharePoint 2013?
We've actually done a few environments that way. Again, as Joe kind of talked about, we're really passing the VHDs over. So in this case, it doesn't really matter to us whether it's 2013 or 2010 or even 2007 in this case. We're able to basically do that replication by simply using the VHDs. So pretty simple as far as the warm is concerned itself.
All right, I think we might have some more here. I'm just getting sent to me.
We had a question on there, it looks like, about SQL always on with the config databases and making sure that always works. Yeah, certainly we've done that for customers. So we do require the SQL Enterprise and the always on to be able to pass, especially if you're using SAN data and things like that. We need to make sure those databases are being passed back and forth. And yeah, we've successfully done that in our environments and then have customers do it as well. So certainly not a problem doing so.
Okay, we got an SLA question from Kyle. It said, what is your SLA for a warm cutover?
Sure, I'll take this one as well. Basically, as far as the warm cutover concerned, it's difficult as far as the SLA is concerned because, as Joe mentioned, a lot of it comes down to the DNS propagation. So as far as our part, it's really simple. Once the disaster occurs, we're simply going to spin up those servers, and the data has already been passed back and forth. So really, it's anywhere from 5 to 15 minutes on our end. The issue comes down to the DNS propagation. So again, as long as you set that TTL down to, say, 5 minutes, you're going to find it propagates pretty quickly, but there's no way for us to guarantee, hey, it's going to be up and running in an hour. If you've got customers that are in China, for example, it may take a little longer to propagate there. So that's why we have that hot option. If you can't have any sort of downtime, that's where the hot option will come into play.
All right, now Matthew is asking, how expensive is the hot standby environment when compared to cold and warm options?
Sure. So cold is obviously the cheapest because we're really just shipping a set of databases off to a secondary data center. The warm is really just a replica of your current environment for the most part. Again, you don't have to pay for the second set of licenses because they're technically not up and running, if you will. So you save there. The hot is certainly the most expensive option, and it really depends on your environment. So we do have to bring in some additional hardware. Like I said, we typically use F5s on our end just because that's what company we're familiar with and have used in the past. So we do have that piece of hardware, and then you're also going to have the additional licensing, so you do have to pay for 2 sets. Now, depending on how your enterprise agreement works with Microsoft and what you have, we can typically reuse some of your licensing to help compensate for that. But as far as giving you kind of an exact price, it's really hard to do because it's based on the environment itself, which is why we tend to scale the hot environments back a bit. Usually they're the larger enterprise customers that have the hot environments, so you're typically looking at an 8-server and above production farm. So we typically try to cut it in half if we can, but again, we can certainly have multiple load balanced web front ends to kind of compensate for that. So I know it doesn't technically answer the question, but we would kind of need to see the environment and base it off of that. So.
All right, I'm gonna put out one more question here, and remember, you guys can keep on asking questions using hashtag Fpwebinar on Twitter. So when this meeting ends, then yeah, we'll continue to reach out to you and get you all the answers. But we got time for one more, and it's from Steve. He asks, what are the main differences between a managed backup via something similar to Commvault versus HyperV Replica?
Sure. So, and I guess I can go ahead and take this one since I've taken the other one.
All the other ones.
Basically, with our managed backup service, essentially what we're doing there is we're taking the SQL, we're taking the local disk, and then we're taking a SharePoint item level backup, and we're basically pushing them off to our backup servers. When we're doing the actual hot environment, it's a little different because we're actually taking every 5 to 15 minutes, we're taking those VHDs and pushing the incrementals over to the warm environment. So really there's, I would say, there's very little loss of data. Whereas if you're doing the managed backups, it's not a transactional backup, it's a nightly backup. So you could lose up to, let's say 24 hours would be the most you could possibly lose. But you could lose up to 24 hours worth of data. And then on top of that, if you don't have servers up and running, which is what the warm backup is for, then obviously it takes time, at least on our end, to spin up that environment, restore the SQL databases, and then obviously restore your item level piece as well. So the difference is basically, obviously, the managed backup is the most cost-effective option, but again, you're going to lose some data, and then you're not going to be up and running as fast. So hopefully that answers the question.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jesse. I will wake Joe up, and we'll get him back. Now, that was excellent. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for the questions. Like I said, keep asking questions if you got them. We're always happy to help. Also, when these recordings become available, please send them to somebody you think that can help them. In the meantime, we'll see you next time, and thanks again for joining us. Thanks, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone listening.